Ever feel like you're drowning in news after a hurricane hits? Try and sort through all the headlines just to figure out, like, what happens next? How things get put back together? Well, that's exactly why we're here today. We're doing a deep dive into FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and their role after Hurricanes Helene and Milton.
And right off the bat, it's important to remember we're talking about two separate hurricanes here. Two different areas impacted, which of course has huge implications when we get to talking about aid and how it's distributed.
Okay, so two very different situations. But when we see, disaster movies, FEMA is always those guys showing up late with the water bottles. Is it really more complicated than that?
Oh, way more. What's really interesting is that FEMA's work actually starts way before a hurricane even forms. Preparedness is a huge part of their mission.
So it's not just about reacting to the disaster when it happens.
Right. They work with communities, to create disaster readiness plans.
Yeah.
Because being prepared can really, drastically reduce the impact of a hurricane. It makes a huge difference.
So it's about proactively preventing a bigger disaster down the line.
Exactly. But obviously, when a hurricane like Helene or Milton actually hits, that's when those FEMA response teams get activated.
Right. Got to jump into action.
And you're right. It's way more than just, sending supplies, though that's definitely a part of it. Think more like coordinating all those emergency response teams, setting up shelters, providing medical assistance. It's a massive, massive logistical undertaking.
Wow. I can only imagine. So I have to ask then, allocating those funds effectively, especially with two major hurricanes so close together, what goes into deciding how much aid each state gets? Is it just based on, the dollar amount of damage?
Yeah, no, it's definitely not that simple. We're talking, a massive amount of money here, like $1.8 billion in federal aid just for Helene and Milton combined.
Wow. Okay, so where does that money actually go?
Well, it's important to understand that each storm, it has its own separate funding pool.
Okay.
And those are determined by a bunch of things. The severity of the damage, obviously.
Right.
And the needs of those communities, what they're facing.
So it's not like there's this big pot of money and they're both dipping into it.
Exactly. They're separate. And within that, there's this crucial distinction between individual assistance and public assistance.
Okay, so break that down for me.
So individual assistance, that goes directly to people, right? People who need temporary housing, help with home repairs, even replacing personal belongings. Things they lost in the storm. It's about getting families back on their feet.
Right, those immediate needs. That makes sense. But then what about the larger scale stuff, like rebuilding roads, the power grid, all that?
You got it. That's where public assistance comes in. That focuses on those bigger recovery efforts. Think debris removal, repairing roads and bridges, getting that critical infrastructure back online.
Power, water, all that.
Exactly. And those projects, they require a ton of funding, obviously. And that's where you see a lot of collaboration between FEMA and then the state and local agencies.
So FEMA's not swooping in and taking over?
Not at all. It's definitely a team effort. FEMA provides a lot of the funding, of course, and the guidance. But the actual work on the ground, a lot of times, falls to those local teams. They're the ones who know their communities best.
Right. They know it needs to happen.
Exactly. So FEMA's more like this financial hub, you could say.
Yeah.
And a coordinating body, making sure those resources are used effectively.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. So let's talk about those resources a bit. We've got North Carolina facing this massive cleanup after Helene, right? And then Florida's dealing with the aftermath of two hurricanes back to back. How does FEMA even begin to assess needs in a situation like that?
So damage assessments, that's key.
Okay.
FEMA, they send teams out to these impacted areas, and they're evaluating the extent of the damage, and they look at everything. The number of homes that were destroyed, obviously, how badly was the infrastructure hit, and then what's the overall economic impact going to be on that community?
So it's not just about how many houses were damaged, it's looking at the long-term consequences as well?
Exactly. It's about understanding those ripple effects, like a damaged bridge. On the surface, might seem like a localized problem.
Right.
But it can disrupt supply chains, access to healthcare, even just the community's ability to rebuild. So all of that factors into those assessments, which then determines how much funding each area is going to get.
And what specific programs need to be put in place.
Exactly.
So let's get into some specifics here. We know North Carolina is looking at, over $108 million in aid for 82,000 households impacted by Helene. How does that compare to what's happening in Florida with, two hurricanes hitting them?
Well, Florida's a bit unique here, right? Because they got hit by both Helene and Milton.
Right.
So they're looking at over $253 million for Let me see, a little over 81,000 households impacted by Helene.
Okay, so significantly more than North Carolina. But then again, Florida's a much bigger state too, so.
True. But the population size itself isn't the deciding factor. Remember those damage assessments we talked about?
Okay.
Well, Helene, it really hit Florida hard, even more so than North Carolina.
Oh, wow.
Okay, well, widespread flooding, major infrastructure damage, the works, really. So that's why their funding for Helene is higher.
Makes sense. And then they got hit with Milton on top of that. What's the situation there?
Right. So the thing with Milton is the impact just wasn't as severe.
Okay.
So even though more households were technically impacted, the damage from Helene was just so much worse.
Right, right.
So for Milton, they're receiving $67 million for around 84,000 households.
Okay, so even though more households affected, that damage from Helene really makes a difference in the funding. It really shows how these assessments, they're not just looking at one thing. It's a big picture view.
Exactly.
But it's not just about the money, right? I mean, what kind of support are people actually getting on the ground beyond just the financial aid?
That's a really important point. We hear a lot about the financial assistance, obviously.
Right.
But FEMA also plays this huge role in providing more direct support to survivors.
Okay, so what does that look like? Like, practically speaking.
So one example is these disaster recovery centers that FEMA sets up.
Okay.
And they put these in communities that were hit. And they basically become these hubs where survivors can go and access all kinds of services.
So more than just a place to, like, apply for aid.
Oh, way more. You can connect directly with FEMA representatives, get help filing claims, even access resources from other organizations that are involved in the recovery effort.
So it's about cutting through all the red tape, getting people the help they need quickly.
Exactly.
I like it.
And because everyone's situation is different, FEMA also has these disaster survivor assistance teams.
Okay, I don't think I've heard of those.
These are folks who are actually going into these neighborhoods, going door to door, connecting with survivors face to face.
Wow, that's pretty incredible.
Yeah. And these teams, they're trained to really assess those individual needs, offer guidance, even just provide emotional support.
Yeah, because sometimes you just need someone to listen, especially after going through something like that.
Exactly. So they might help a family find somewhere to live temporarily, connect them with mental health services, whatever they need.
It really sounds like FEMA's role is so much bigger than what we tend to see. It's not just about writing checks. It's about really being there for communities and helping them not just recover, but rebuild stronger.
Absolutely. And recognizing that recovery is about so much more than just, rebuilding houses and roads. It's about rebuilding lives and communities.
Well said. This has been a real eye-opener for sure. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines and all the numbers, but there's so much more to the story. So as we wrap things up, here's something for everyone listening to consider. As we learn from these recent hurricanes, from Helene and Milton, how can we take those lessons and apply them to our own communities? How can we all be better prepared for whatever Mother Nature throws our way? Something to think about.